Dr. Hinkie here with the video lecture for Chapter 44, and I should have 45 up shortly. So, Chapter 44 is on population ecology. We'll be studying in this chapter covering populations. So we talked about the organization of life and how life is organized through atoms up to cells. That's our first living structure, cells, and then cells to tissues. Groups of similar cells work together as tissues. So that's similar cells with similar function. We put different tissue types together to get organs, and organs are have specific jobs in the body, and they're made of different tissue types that work together. Then we can take different organs and put them together into an organ system, and then we get to the individual level. And all the individuals of the same species are the population. Beyond that, the population are all the organisms of the same species living in a given area. Beyond that, we have communities, different types of organisms, different species interacting with each other in the same area. And then we go to ecosystems that include not only the living portion of that designated area, but also the non-living parts, the air, the water, the soil. So we're going to focus first on population because before we see how all of those components interact with each other, we have to understand how populations work. So in this, we'll look at ecology just broadly, what ecology is, look at population demographics, the distribution of populations, how we describe populations, the ways that populations grow, and how that population growth is limited. We'll look at some life history patterns, some strategies for population growth, and then we'll take a little zoom into specifically human populations. We are living organisms. We are subject to all of the same principles, limitations, and requirements as any other living organism. Our objectives for this chapter, what you should be able to do, what you should know at the end of this, are listed here. Identify the ecological levels that exist within the field of ecology. So habitat, population, community, ecosystem, and biosphere. You should be able to define those, know how they're related to each other. Define population density, distinguish among three different types of population distribution. We should also understand resources and limiting factors that affect population density and distribution. Define the rate of natural increase, or R, and the biotic potential of species. Describe differences in survivorship curves. We'll look more closely at those and what they tell us. Describe exponential growth, including what semiparity and iteroparity mean. You'll be able to describe logistic growth of a population and circumstances that encourage that, and define what carrying capacity is and how that affects the growth of a population. We'll look at density independent factors and dependent factors, how competition predation affect population size. We'll look at life history patterns that are known as R selection and K selection, how that affects life history and population demographics. There's some information in the book on deer species and how their population exploded, and we came to an overpopulation of deer in many areas. And then we'll look at human demographics. So when we talk about ecology, it's a study of the interaction of organisms among all the different organisms in their physical environment. So communities, just among all organisms. We're talking about communities. So interaction of organisms, any population with all the other populations in their physical environment. Habitat is where an organism lives. So what is in the environment around it, the resources it has, the other living organisms in that area. A population are all the individuals of a given species in a particular area at a given time. A community are all the different species in that area. So for example, on a coral reef, we have corals, we have crabs, we have fish, lots of invertebrates, lots of different species all interacting. An ecosystem consists of the community, all the living organisms in an area, with the non-living or abiotic components. So sunlight, water, soil, air, all the different non-living factors in that area. And the biosphere, all the zones in the earth, soil, water, and air where organisms are found. So one thing to understand about modern ecology, we talked about this when we talked about scientific method, about what theories are. Theories are predictive. They're based on lots and lots of information and evidence gathered through lots and lots of experiments through to hypothesis testing that give us a model that I can study a variable, an area, a particular phenomenon, and I can make some predictions about what I expect to find or what will happen in the future. That's what a theory does. And every time I go out and I look and I find, hey, my prediction was right, that validates my theory. So modern ecology doesn't just describe habitats, populations, communities, but it looks at these relationships and it tests them so that it can be predictive. What's going to happen to this habitat, population, community if some factor or variable is changed? So it is subject to the scientific method, as are all the topics we cover. So first we'll talk about demographics. Demography is the statistical study of a population. And a lot of that focuses on population density and distribution. So density is the number of individuals per unit area. How closely packed are the individuals in a given space? The distribution is what patterns does that distribution take? So that pattern are all the individuals in one spot in that area. I might have the entire city, if I look at the city boundaries of Charleston, are people evenly distributed? No, in more rural areas, they're more spread out. Downtown, they're more closely packed. So that distribution, what's the pattern? And then we look at what are limiting factors. What determines those shapes or those patterns of distribution? Why do organisms live where they live? So if we want to characterize the distribution of a population, there are basically three descriptions we can use. And when we look at any population, we can find all the individuals clumped together. We can find them randomly distributed in a given area, or we can find uniform distribution, evenly spaced out. The distribution patterns don't have to be constant. So an organism might experience each of these or more than one of these at different phases in its life history. For example, desert shrubs were found to change, starting as clumped when they were juveniles, and as the plants matured, they moved to a more uniform distribution. So if you think about how plants reproduce through seeds, if those seeds drop right below the parent plant, we're going to have clumps or clusters of new plants when they're juveniles. Over time, though, those that grow fastest are going to use up most of the resources. They're going to grow taller. They're going to block shade from their siblings around them and prevent them from growing. So each one will eventually come to inhabit its own specific area, and the plants will eventually, as mature plants, be distributed evenly or uniformly throughout that habitat. And so here's a picture. Initially, they're clumped. As they grow, some clumps become bigger, some smaller, as different organisms more successfully use the resources, until eventually those that are most successful take up a specific area. What we tend to see is clumped populations. If we're looking at animals especially, we'll see clumped populations where all the organisms tend to live where resources are available. So in the desert, we find populations clustered around where water is available. Uniform distribution we tend to see when organisms are territorial, and so they guard or protect the space containing all the resources they need. And so they have uniform distribution. Even this is my area and it abuts the neighboring area. And then random distribution is when resources are readily available. Organisms are not necessarily territorial, but resources are everywhere, so the organism can be anywhere. The other thing we want to know about populations, beside their distribution or density and how they're distributed throughout the area we're interested in, is how fast they're growing. So population growth, we can look at the rate of natural increase. That in biology, in calculations, is designated by a lowercase r, and it's determined by the number of births minus the number of deaths. That's our rate of natural increase. The biotic potential is the maximum rate of natural increase. So if we have ideal conditions, nothing limiting births or deaths, we'll get our maximum growth. So the factors that could influence reproduction include things like the number of offspring who survive to reproductive age. The more that survive to reproductive age, the faster we can increase that population, the higher our biotic potential. The amount of competition within the population. So competition occurs when resources are limited. So if there's unlimited resources, I don't have to compete. I know there's always going to be food and space and water and everything I need. If resources are limited, I have to compete, and that will limit who can survive and reproduce. The age of and number of reproductive opportunities. So if a lot of the population have not yet reached reproductive maturity or sexual maturity, there won't be as many reproductive opportunities. Or if they're beyond their typical reproductive years, not as many opportunities. If we have a lot who are of reproductive age, that biotic potential will be much higher. Also, if there are sufficient other individuals of reproductive age, the opportunities are higher, particularly for most species, not all, but for most species. You have to have the right number of females, because females, because of gestation, because they're the ones who are carrying the offspring, and that usually has a time commitment where they are no longer able to reproduce during that period. If you have fewer females, you have fewer reproductive opportunities as they become gravid. Then we have a period of time where males can't reproduce. So that distribution of sex and what age the sex or gender of each group is has a role in determining biotic potential. And then the presence of disease and predators obviously can limit our rate of reproduction. So biotic potential, the maximum growth under ideal conditions, is influenced by the number of offspring that each reproductive event results in as well. So, for example, mice, a lot of different rodents, insects, lots and lots and lots of individuals with each reproductive event, that population can grow really quickly. Whereas if we only have one or two offspring per reproductive event, and there's a long gestation period where this female rhino, while carrying this before birth, would be out of the reproductive population. And then they also spend significant time caring for those young, so they're removed from the reproductive population. So this population is going to grow much more slowly. So when we look at demographics and population growth, we look at birth rates and death rates. So we want to look at the mortality patterns. And we can graph these mortality patterns out as a way to see what we expect the population is going to look like over time. And we do that by mapping cohorts. A cohort is a group composed of all the members of a population born at the same time. And we use life tables, or tables or graphs, to graph out and show what's the mortality pattern. What happens to this population, this type of organism, their population over time? So we can map our mortality from our mortality tables into survivorships, or survivorship curves. Survivorship is the probability that any newborn in an individual cohort is going to survive to a particular age. So what are the odds? This is what actuary tables tell us in the insurance industry. Survivorship. So here's a life table for Bluegrass cohort. So this is out of all of the individuals, so age 0 to 3 months, so newborns. We have 843 individual grasses, Bluegrass cohort. From 0 to 3 months, here's how many are probably going to die. This is my mortality rate at a very young age. Number of seeds per individual, well, they're below the reproductive age. Here we get to 3 to 6 months. Oh, observed number alive, sorry, not dying. This is the number dying. Some die, more die. Ooh, more die. As we get older, more die. How many are alive from our original total number? Well, fewer are alive every time more die, decreases over time. So we see our mortality rate here initially increases, then continues to increase per capita till all of them are dead. None live to be 24 months. And then the number of seeds they reproduce. Looking at this data, we could analyze this and figure out what's going to happen to this population over time, or to any population. This is showing us a trend. So we can map that out into survivorships, where we plot the number of organisms that survive at each age. What we tend to see is, based on the species reproductive and lifestyle strategies, we get different types of curves. One curve is called type 1 that shows a population where most individuals are going to survive past the midpoint of their lifespan. Death is usually coming toward the end of life. So humans are an example of this. Most people live fairly long. Average human lifespan is 74 years. Most people live pretty close to that point. Type 2 is a linear death curve. It's not really a curve, it's a straight line. Death is unrelated to age. You are equally likely to die at any point in your lifespan. This tends to be true of rodents. Think of a squirrel. They're equally likely to die at any point in their life. Not particularly high mortality rate of newborn squirrels. Or old squirrels. At any point they could get eaten by a hawk, run over by a car, fall out of a tree, whatever they do. They're equally likely at any point. And then type 3 populations, most individuals die very young. These tend to be populations that produce lots and lots of offspring, have very little parental care. Sea turtles are an example of this. In a clutch of 300 eggs, when they hatch and head for the sea, lots are going to get picked off by birds right away as they're trying to get to the ocean. Some others are going to get disoriented by lights on shore and die before they reach the sea. Once they hit the water, there's going to be lots of fish and sharks and predators waiting for them to pluck them off. And just a very few of those individuals are going to survive to reproductive age. So what those different survivorship curves look like is type 1. Most people survive till pretty late in life. And then we see a rapid decrease in population of those that live to old age. 2, we have our straight line. Our death is unrelated to age. You are equally likely to die at any time. Reptiles are another example of this, and rodents. Survivorship of my type 3, insects are a good example. Lots and lots and lots and lots of offspring that get picked off by predators right away. Death comes very early on, and a few will survive the total lifespan. So those are my 3 different survivorship curves. So we have 2 different types of model population growth models. And these models are based on how, going back to that, to the picture of the rhinoceros and the mouse. Similarity refers to populations where the individuals usually have only a single reproductive event in their lifetime. Oops, sorry, got that reverse similarity. And then they die. So similarity would be I guess the mouse is not a good example of that either. It would be like the cicadas. When they emerge, you hear lots of those at night now, they emerge, they reproduce, and they die. So they have a single reproductive event in their lifetime. And there are a lot of insects that follow that. They reproduce once and die. And this is an adaptation to an unstable environment. They become dormant. Those cicadas are dormant. They're hiding in a dormant state until conditions are ripe for them to survive and reproduce very quickly. And they emerge, they reproduce, they die. And their offspring then use up lots of resources and then go into their own dormant phase until conditions are ripe for reproduction again. Iteroparity is when members of a population have many reproductive events throughout their lifetime. So most vertebrates are like that. The rhinoceros would be an example of this. Doesn't have a whole lot, doesn't have as many reproductive events as the mouse, but it can reproduce more than one time. Humans fall into this, shrubs, trees. This is an adaptation to a stable environment where your chances of your children, your offspring surviving are high. So think about if something is an iterative process, it happens again and again. So iteroparity, I reproduce again and again, multiple times. And then similarity is a single time. So if I chart out the numbers, if I take all that information about a species and put it in together and start tracking the numbers, I can get a growth model. I can chart out those numbers. And typically what we see is exponential growth. But we'll see this for a little bit in most species. Exponential growth occurs when the number of individuals added each generation increases really quickly. Biotic potential is having the full effect. That means everybody reproduces as much as they can. So if I start out with 2 individuals, they're going to reproduce. I'm going to have 4. Those 4, we're going to have 8. 8 are going to have 16. 16 are going to have 32, 64, 128. So every generation I get more and more and more and more individuals at our maximum possible rate. What I end up with is a curve that looks like the letter J. And let's take a look at this here. So exponential growth, I get a J. So I have this lag phase because I have very few numbers. So I have just a few individuals if I have 10 individuals with 5 females, then I can double that. I can get 12, a little more than double. So you see, initially, because I have few individuals, I'm not going to get a lot of numbers right away. But as I have more individuals, if I have 100 individuals reproducing, I'm going to end up, even if it's just 1-to-1, I'm going to end up with 200, then 200, 400. Those 400 become 800. Those 800 become 1,600. I can increase really, really rapidly. So I have a J-shaped curve. And the phases of this J, here it's called the lag phase, where I have slow growth because the population is small. These numbers over here aren't 10, 20, 30. It's in thousands. So 10,000, 20,000. It takes me a long time. If I start with just 1 or 2 individuals, it takes a really long time to get to 1,000. Doesn't take nearly as long to get to 20, 30,000, and then less time to get to 30, 40, and then I really start to shoot up. This is the exponential phase. Growth is accelerating. It happens faster and faster each generation. The reality, though, is that this can't go on indefinitely. So in reality, what I end up with, I can start with something that looks like that exponential growth curve, but then it's going to level out. So this becomes more of an S shape than a J shape. This is called logistic growth. So in logistic growth, I have something that's going to prevent or limit that continued rapid rise. Usually this is something, waste products accumulate in the environment, the food supply runs out. So as the population increases, the effects of predation, of parasites, disease, and competition intensifies. Right? Predators have an easier time finding individuals to prey on if there are more of them, if they're more abundant. If I have a really high population, it's easier for the predators to find and catch me. So all of those things, parasites and disease, spread more easily with more individuals because my population density increases. It's easier for those to spread. And the more individuals I have, the more competition I have among the others of my species. So all those things are going to limit my growth. So in this curve, I have that lag phase. Population small, so it takes me a while for my numbers to increase. I do start to go through exponential growth as the number of reproductive individuals increases. But then I start to slow down because the numbers are high enough that I'm depleting resources, that competition starts to take over. I can't reproduce at full biotic potential at the maximum rate. And for many populations, what happens is I'm going to reach a stable equilibrium phase where the number of births and deaths are about equal. In some organisms, if this slowdown doesn't happen quickly, if this doesn't happen gradually, the population can shoot so far past this that it completely destroys the environment, and then its population crashes. And then we start back over here with those few that do survive, if any survive. So some organisms don't level out. Can anybody think of examples where that might happen? So if reproduction happens really, really quickly, so there's not a long gravid period or pregnancy period, if we're just going to lay lots of eggs and they're all going to hatch all at the same time. If I'm here and every individual at this point produces 1,000 eggs, when they all hatch, we're going to be up here, and that whole population is going to compete with those resources, and we're going to crash. If I have a slower reproductive period or slower generation time, individuals can adapt a little more closely to this as there's more competition. Oh, I can wait and delay. We're not going to reproduce. I don't have enough resources for reproduction to occur right now. So they're more likely to approach this line. So that line is called carrying capacity, where my J-shaped curve levels off, becomes an S-shaped curve. The carrying capacity, it's indicated by the letter K, is the maximum number of individuals of a given species that the community or the ecosystem can support, So we approach K, we level off because any more, and we put too much of a drain on the ecosystem. This K is not a given set number. It can change depending on the environmental conditions. So if we're in a drought, all of a sudden there's not enough water, this K value can decrease, come down here. In good years when there's plenty of food, plenty of water, the weather's good, there are no disruptive events, that carrying capacity might increase in the same habitat for the same species. So what's going to regulate where that K is? We have biotic factors and abiotic factors that will help level that growth curve. So biotic factors that can regulate growth are those related to living organisms. So the biotic factors are things like competition within the species, how many predators are out there. So those are living things. And abiotic conditions are non-living, like rainfall. So within those, we have density independent factors. These are often the abiotic conditions. It doesn't matter how many individuals of an organism there are in the area, they're all going to get wiped out if a density independent factor happens. So natural disaster. A forest fire doesn't care how many individuals there are of your species in the forest. If it burns down the forest, everybody's going to die. Density-dependent factors that control population growth are related to how likely you are to encounter these factors, because the more of you there are, the more individuals there are, the more closely packed together you are, the more likely you're going to be killed by one of these factors. So competition is density dependent. You're competing for the same resources, for the same food, the same space, the same mates. The closer packed you are, the more intense that competition becomes. Predation, the more of your species there are in a given area, the easier job predators have taking you out. And then parasitism and disease, the closer you are, densely packed populations, it's easier for disease to spread. So here's an example. This is St. Paul Island in Alaska, and this is a reindeer. And the reindeer, their population went through, we see sort of this J curve here, where we're going through exponential growth, everything's good, there are few predators because we've hunted all the apex predators out. We don't like wolves and bears, so we kill them, and so the population can just go crazy. And as long as there is available food, the population grew, until the population was so high that overgrazing reduced all the resource, so all their food source. And then there wasn't enough food to sustain the population, and they died. They dropped off significantly. So if we look at population at density-dependent versus density-independent factors, what percentage of the population would die? What's the mortality percentage given these factors? Here this shows density-independent factors. I don't care what your population density is. If this event happens, an earthquake, a forest fire, a hurricane, everybody in its path wiped out. Density-dependent, well, the effect of it, the mortality rate, is low at lower population densities. Disease doesn't spread as readily if we're spaced out, if we're spread apart. As we get closer and closer together, disease spreads more quickly. All right, we can evaluate populations in terms of their life history patterns. When we look at life history, we're talking about what are the number of births per reproduction. Is there a single individual, a small litter size of 2 to 3, or thousands? What's the age at which reproduction occurs? When does reproductive maturity or sexual maturity occur? When can organisms start reproducing? What's the total lifespan? So can I have more than one reproductive event in my life, or is it short lifespan, one reproductive event, and that's it? And then what's the probability of any individual living the entire lifespan and therefore reproducing, and how many times? So each population, any population, can only get so much of the available energy in its given area that it inhabits. That's food. How much energy we can get. How is the energy distributed among the lifespan? So I have to have energy to reproduce, I have to have energy to grow, I have to have energy to survive, I have to have energy to go out and hunt down food to get more energy. And if I reproduce, the physical act of reproduction takes energy, but also caring for offspring can take energy, depending on the parental care pattern. So we can have lots of different life history patterns. There's an example in the book of Toads and Frogs that even if species are related, it doesn't mean they have the same life history pattern. We might have one that has extensive care involved in the offspring and raising the offspring, and others that just hatch, have some eggs, take off, leave. So fish, we look at fish, seahorses, extensive care of offspring by the male. Versus many fish that are just broadcast spawners. They just release eggs and sperm into the water and off they go. Zero care involved. So related species, we can't just generalize each species. We have to look at individually to see what their life history patterns are. To look at life history patterns, we can have R strategists. So R strategist, R refers to the rate of natural increase in populations. And we can have K strategists. So K strategist, K refers to the carrying capacity. So some populations are subject to R selection or have an R strategy toward life. They're going for rapid increase in population. Other populations are K selected. They're shooting for this nice, stable, let's reach that carrying capacity and just let things ride. So if we look at our R strategists, they tend to be opportunistic species. We think of them as weeds. They produce a large number of offspring. They typically have a very small body size, so they can disperse really early, and they reach reproductive maturity early, right away, so they can reproduce and have lots of offspring again. They often have a short lifespan. They don't invest energy in parental care, insects, weeds, broadcast spawners. They tend to be good dispersers and colonizers of new habitats. So they spread out far and wide. They look for an opportunity where they can take advantage of those resources and grow and reproduce. So those are our strategists, lots of reproduction really quickly to get into new spaces. Then we have our K strategists. These are considered equilibrium species. They're at that balance, that carrying capacity. They've reached equilibrium with their numbers right there. They typically have a small number of offspring, usually looking at organisms with relatively larger body sizes. They reach reproductive maturity relatively later in life. So not immediately upon being born. So, humans, we reach our reproductive maturity during adolescence. Different organisms take longer to reach reproductive maturity. If it takes you until you're 30 to reach reproductive maturity, you're going to have a much slower growth rate in your population than if you are reproductive at age 1 month. They usually have a long lifespan. They put lots of time into parental care, so they tend not to reproduce quickly or have separate litters very quickly because they invest energy into care of their offspring. And these tend to be very strong competitors. So, as I said, some weeds, dandelions, great R strategists. Those little fuzzballs are going to disperse really, really quickly and really, really far. And all those seeds, no parental care, they're going to be distributed and they're going to grow. They're going to find an area where there's no competition, and next thing you know, there's some more dandelions. K strategists going to have long parental care, larger organism, adapted to a stable environment. I'm not going to spread out very far because I have what I need here. I'm slower to mature, to reach reproductive maturity, and then when I do reproduce, I'm going to invest more time and energy into my offspring. So with either strategy, we can have a population that grows too large. We can exceed that carrying capacity more likely in certain circumstances than others. So if we remove limiting factors, some external limiting factors like predators, I disrupt that balance of carrying capacity. I don't have one of the factors that is slowing my growth, and so I can shoot my population too high so there aren't enough resources to sustain it. So populations that are too large, usually what we see is they suffer from starvation or disease because disease is spreading rapidly as their population density increases, or they can contaminate their own habitat with too much waste because not only do we have to eat resources, we metabolically process those and get rid of the toxic portion. So the example in the book is after deer hunting was banned on Long Island, the deer population quickly outgrew the available food sources. So many of those died from starvation. So that population, hunters became the sole predator on deer because in that area we've eliminated apex predators, they're natural predators, bear, wolf, all the animals that would prey on them, and so it's up to hunters to control that population. So you ban hunting, and oops, now nothing's controlling that population. So hunting is a really good conservation management tool that's very important, especially in areas that don't have natural predators available. Another example, bacteria. When we grow them in a lab, put them in a petri dish, and that petri dish contains the food that they need. And if I put one bacteria, one cell on that petri dish, it's going to divide into 2. Those 2 will divide into 4, those 4 into 8 to 16, and so on. We get that J curve, and the whole time they're growing, they're using the food that I gave them, and they're producing metabolic wastes. If I don't transfer those bacteria to new fresh media with new nutrients and with no wastes periodically, then they are just going to contaminate themselves to death and will eventually die. There's a picture of a white-tailed deer. So you can read that case study in your textbook. The last portion of this chapter deals with population growth, with human population growth. Our population, human population, has steadily risen. We are now at about 7.4 billion. We reached 6 billion in the year 2000. Before 1750, the rate of population growth was pretty slow. And again, if we look at that J curve, that's that lag time. The fewer individuals we have, the slower growth occurs. But as the population size increases, so does the rate of growth. We get exponential. So the doubling time of the human population ranges between 35 to 60 years right now. If we look throughout history, to get from 1 billion, so it took 1,800 years to get to 1 billion people. To get to 2 billion, the doubling time, took from 1800 to 1930, 130 years. Ooh, but to get from 2 billion to 4 billion, only took 44 years. Now, if we look, we're at 2017, 7.4. We're not quite at 8 billion. We have not quite doubled. We anticipate about 50 years doubling time now. So our rate of growth is actually slowing. We may be stabilizing around that carrying capacity right now. If we look at areas, because that growth is not uniform throughout the world, if we look at areas, more developed countries tend to have slower population growth. North America, Europe, Japan, Australia. These countries have a higher standard of living, lower population density. The resources that are available can be distributed between more people. Everyone can have more of the resources because our rate of growth is slower. So demographic transition has occurred in these countries where we have a decreased death rate, but also a decreased birth rate. So our standard of living and healthcare has reduced the death rate, but we also have a decrease in birth rate. So population growth has stabilized. Less developed countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia particularly have rapid population growth. They have a low standard of living, divvy up the resources between more people, we have less per person. So some strategies that are in place or that these countries are looking at to reduce population growth to be to sort of not exceed that carrying capacity include family planning programs, social progress. Social progress has a lot of different aspects to it, but two of the biggest are education and more opportunities for women. So education, as people become more educated, they tend to want more out of life and expect more and to have more things, and they tend to delay the onset of reproduction. And then raising the status of women, giving women opportunities at equality, at business opportunities, and at taking agency over their own life. Women tend to prefer to invest more time in raising a few children well rather than having lots. So we end up with reduced child mortality in that case too. So social progress, improving education and the status of women and healthcare all lead to lower birth rates. And then if we delay the onset of childbearing and have wider spacing of births, we can also reduce population growth. Why do we want to reduce population growth? Because humans are subject to all of those same physical, chemical, biological constraints in the world that every other organism is. So we can see here more developed countries have slower population growth, less developed have higher. There is a carrying capacity to total number of individuals in any given area. So I'm going to slow that down so we don't exceed that carrying capacity. So if we look at human population growth, we can see what's going to happen in the future. We want to study demographics to make predictive models about what's going to happen in the future to the population, so we can look at what's going to happen to the resources. What resources will we need in the future? And to study population growth and make predictions about what will happen in the future, we need to know what the age distributions are. Within a population, what percentage are pre-reproductive, so young children? What percentage of the population is reproductive, so adolescent through adulthood? And how many are post-reproductive? If we know the age structure, we can predict changes in the population in the future and what that means, the implications to the economy and resources. So more developed countries tend to have a more stable age structure. We're more evenly distributed between all three. And lesser developed countries tend to have a more youthful profile, meaning there are many more individuals who are pre-reproductive or reproductive, so are still reproducing, that are in the population, and so reproduction continues at a high rate. Zero population growth, ZPG, this refers to no increase in population size, being a stable population, leveling out at that carrying capacity. It doesn't mean no reproduction. It means replacement reproduction. So individuals have offspring to replace themselves in the future population, as opposed to more than replacement value. So those age structure diagrams, this is a stable age structure diagram. Yes, my next generation, these pre-reproductive children, are going to grow up. Most are going to survive. We looked at that type 1 survivorship curve. So these will become reproductive, replacing these pre-reproductive individuals. And then they will age out of reproductive age. And here we're still using resources in the society. We're still contributing to economic growth, economic development, but not reproducing. So here I can look at this and predict what's going to happen to my population in the future. Probably going to stay pretty stable. Here I can see I have a lot more individuals in reproductive age contributing to this pre-reproductive population, many more than I do in this post-reproductive age. So this population, the number of pre-reproductive individuals, is going to increase because I have quite a few individuals at reproductive age. These are going to age up into the reproductive age and start reproducing. Well, there are more of them, so the odds are they will reproduce at a higher rate. So this is a growing population. Why do we care about that? The environmental impact of human population growth. We are living organisms. We are animals like any other and subject to all of those factors that we talked about related to population density and disease and resource use. So when we look at the environmental impact of population growth, it's not a matter of being a tree hugger. It's a matter of our own species survival. So we can look at the environmental impact in terms of population size, resource consumption, and pollution based on resource consumption. So we can look at absolute numbers for population growth and find overpopulation due to increased number of individuals. which is going to have an impact on the environment, on our resources and on resource consumption because there are more individuals using resources. We can also look at the impact to the resources. So resource use per individual. Increased resource consumption means we deplete them quicker, means that we pollute the environment quicker. And we see this in more developed countries. There are fewer people, but using far more resources than individuals in the lesser developed countries. So this can also have a negative consequence. We end up with a lot more pollution. We take over resources. We use resources at a disproportionate level. So we're taking more than our share, and that can lead to mass extinctions of other organisms because we adversely affect them. So that is, where are we? That is it for this lecture. And I turned you off already? No, I didn't. Okay, there you are. So I will see you all in the next lecture.